November 3, 1943, Pearl Harbor Naval Intelligence Center, Hawaii. Commander Sarah Mitchell's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips as she studied the photographic reconnaissance spread across her desk, images captured by a submarine periscope off the Marshall Islands that documented something her superiors would initially dismiss as impossible. 8 aircraft carriers, steaming in formation, all American, all operational, all deployed simultaneously in the Central Pacific. Her hands trembled slightly as she cross-referenced the vessel identification numbers against known Japanese naval assets, knowing that what she was documenting would fundamentally alter Tokyo's understanding of American industrial capacity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The intelligence photographs told a story that contradicted everything Imperial Japanese Naval Command believed about carrier construction timelines and industrial limitations. While Japanese shipyards struggled to complete even a single fleet carrier, working with steel allocations measured in hundreds of tons and construction crews reduced by conscription, the Americans had somehow produced a formation of 8 carriers that represented more flight deck space than the entire Japanese carrier fleet possessed at the height of their power. Commander Mitchell had served in naval intelligence since 1940, watching the Pacific deteriorate from uneasy peace to total war. She had analyzed countless reconnaissance reports, tracked ship movements, calculated tonnage and construction rates, but nothing in her experience prepared her for this moment. The photographs came from submarine SS-287, the USS Bofin, operating dangerously close to Japanese-controlled waters in the Marshall Islands. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Walsh had risked her boat and crew to surface briefly, extending the periscope long enough to capture these images before diving to escape Japanese patrol aircraft. The images showed something Walsh herself had radioed ahead as unbelievable. A formation so massive it initially appeared to be a photographic error or double exposure. 8 distinct carrier silhouettes, each displacing over 20,000 tons, moving in tactical formation with destroyer escorts and support vessels. The fleet represented a floating air base larger than most Japanese islands could support. Commander Mitchell began the painstaking work of identification. The USS Essex, lead ship of her class, commissioned in December 1942. The USS Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, commissioned in April 1943. The USS Intrepid, commissioned in August 1943. The USS Hornet, another name reclaimed from a sunken predecessor, commissioned in November 1943. The USS Lexington, third carrier to bear that proud name, commissioned in February 1943. The USS Bunker Hill, commissioned in May 1943. The USS Wasp, commissioned in November 1943. 8 fleet carriers. 8 fully operational warships, each capable of carrying 90 aircraft, each representing millions of man-hours of labor, thousands of tons of steel, and industrial capacity that should have been impossible to achieve while simultaneously fighting in Europe, Africa, and across the Pacific. The numbers told a devastating story of decline and desperation. The carrier Shokaku, damaged and under repair since the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The carrier Zuikaku, operational but fuel-starved, conducting training exercises at anchor to conserve precious oil reserves. The carrier Junyo, limping back from damage sustained in multiple engagements, her flight deck patched with whatever materials could be scrounged. The light carrier Chitose, converted from a seaplane tender, representing the desperate improvisation that characterized Japanese naval construction by late 1943. 4 operational carriers, maybe 5 if repair work proceeded faster than expected, against 8 American carriers in this single formation, with intelligence suggesting more under construction. The mathematics of industrial capacity became inescapable. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 21 months from keel laying to commissioning under peacetime conditions. The Americans had compressed this timeline to 14 months, while simultaneously building hundreds of other vessels. The USS Essex herself had been laid down on April 28, 1941, and commissioned on December 31, 1942, 20 months. But the ships in this formation, many commissioned in 1943, represented even faster construction, as American shipyards optimized their processes, trained more workers, and applied mass production techniques to warship construction. Commander Mitchell calculated the steel requirements alone. Each Essex-class carrier required approximately 14,000 tons of steel in its hull and structure. 8 carriers meant 112,000 tons of steel dedicated to just these vessels, while American shipyards simultaneously produced destroyers, cruisers, battleships, submarines, and hundreds of merchant vessels. The steel allocation for this single carrier formation exceeded Japan's entire annual steel production available for naval construction by 1943. Japan's steel industry, never as developed as American or European facilities, had been stretched beyond breaking by simultaneous demands for army equipment, aircraft production, merchant shipping replacement, and naval construction. By late 1943, steel allocations for new naval construction had been slashed repeatedly, with priority given to repairing damaged vessels rather than building new ones. Mitchell remembered the intelligence briefings from earlier in the war, when Japanese victory seemed unstoppable. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had been executed by 6 Japanese carriers, the largest carrier force ever assembled at that time. Those 6 carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, represented the peak of Japanese naval aviation power, a striking force that had taken a decade to build and train. By November 1943, 4 of those 6 carriers rested on the ocean floor, victims of American counterattacks at Coral Sea and Midway. The remaining 2, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were shadows of their former capability, short on fuel, short on aircraft, and desperately short on trained pilots. The pilot shortage represented perhaps the most devastating aspect of Japanese naval decline. Training a carrier pilot required fuel for training flights, aircraft that could be spared from combat operations, and time measured in years for truly proficient aviators. Japan's training program, once rigorous and selective, had been gutted by combat losses and fuel shortages.
New pilots received perhaps 100 hours of flight training compared to the 300 to 400 hours American naval aviators routinely accumulated before their first combat deployment. The pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, veterans with thousands of flight hours, were nearly all dead by late 1943, lost in the grinding attrition of Pacific combat. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Commander Mitchell began preparing her intelligence assessment, knowing it would climb the chain of command to Admiral Chester Nimitz himself, the Pacific Fleet commander who would need this information for strategic planning. Her typewriter clattered in the quiet intelligence center as she documented not just ship identifications, but the broader implications of what these photographs revealed. The United States had achieved something unprecedented in naval history, the ability to produce fleet carriers faster than they could be sunk, creating a situation where American carrier strength was growing even as combat losses occurred, while Japanese carrier strength steadily declined with no possibility of replacement. The economic foundations of this disparity extended far beyond shipyard capacity. American industrial production in 1943 reached levels that seemed almost fantastical when compared to Japanese output. The United States produced approximately 85 million tons of steel in 1943 compared to Japan's 7 million tons. American aircraft production reached 85,000 planes in 1943, while Japan struggled to produce 20,000. American shipyards launched over 10 million tons of merchant shipping in 1943, replacing losses faster than German and Japanese submarines could sink vessels, while Japanese merchant tonnage steadily declined under American submarine attack. The raw numbers told a story of industrial mismatch so severe that strategic calculations became almost meaningless. Mitchell included in her assessment the human dimension of American production capacity. The shipyards building these carriers employed women who had never worked in heavy industry before the war, trained them in welding and riveting and complex assembly work, and achieved productivity rates that exceeded pre-war standards set by experienced male workers. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, had revolutionized carrier construction by applying mass production techniques developed for merchant ship construction, prefabricating large sections of hull and superstructure that could be assembled rapidly once the keel was laid. What had once required custom fitting of thousands of individual pieces now involved the assembly of dozens of large prefabricated sections, each built to precise specifications that allowed rapid integration. The photographs showed more than just 8 carriers. They showed a support fleet of destroyers, cruisers, oilers, and ammunition ships that represented additional industrial capacity beyond the carriers themselves. Each destroyer in the escort required 8 months to build, each cruiser 18 months, each support vessel its own allocation of steel, equipment, and labor. The formation represented not just 8 ships, but an entire ecosystem of naval power, perhaps 30 to 40 vessels total, all moving together, all supplied and maintained, all representing American industrial output that could be sustained indefinitely while simultaneously fighting in multiple theaters.
Commander Mitchell's analysis went deeper into the strategic implications. Japanese naval strategy from the beginning of the war had been based on the assumption of rough parity in carrier strength, the belief that superior Japanese pilot training and tactical doctrine could overcome modest American numerical advantages. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been predicated on this assumption, Japan deploying 4 fleet carriers against what they believed would be perhaps 2 or 3 American carriers. The loss of all 4 Japanese carriers at Midway had been devastating, but Japanese Naval Command had consoled themselves with the belief that American carrier construction, while faster than Japanese, would still require years to replace losses. These photographs destroyed that consolation. American carrier construction had not just replaced Midway losses, it had exceeded pre-war carrier strength by a factor of 3 or 4, with more carriers under construction and no apparent limit to production capacity. The Essex class alone included planned construction of 32 carriers, with the first dozen already launched or nearly complete. Beyond the Essex class, the Americans were building light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, escort carriers converted from merchant ship designs, and planning even larger carriers that would exceed 40,000 tons displacement. The American carrier fleet would continue growing throughout 1944 and 1945, eventually reaching a strength of nearly 100 carriers of all types, a number that represented more carriers than all other navies in the world combined throughout history. Mitchell understood the psychological impact this intelligence would have on Japanese naval commanders. The entire framework of Japanese naval strategy had been built on the assumption that America, while industrially powerful, could be defeated through superior fighting spirit, better training, and tactical excellence. Japanese doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the single overwhelming engagement that would cripple American naval power and force a negotiated peace. But how could there be a decisive battle against an enemy who could replace losses faster than they accumulated? How could fighting spirit overcome industrial capacity measured in millions of tons of steel and thousands of aircraft? The commander included historical context in her assessment, drawing parallels that made the American achievement even more remarkable. The British Royal Navy, the world's dominant naval power for centuries, had never possessed 8 fleet carriers simultaneously. The German Navy, despite Hitler's grand plans, had never completed a single fleet carrier. The combined fleet, at its absolute peak strength in December 1941, had possessed 10 carriers total, including light carriers and converted vessels, accumulated over decades of construction. The Americans had matched Japanese peak carrier strength in less than 2 years of wartime construction and were still accelerating production. The fuel requirements alone for operating 8 carriers simultaneously illustrated another dimension of American advantage. Each carrier consumed approximately 1,000 gallons of fuel oil per hour during flight operations, more during high-speed maneuvering.
8 carriers meant 8,000 gallons per hour, nearly 200,000 gallons per day during intensive operations. The support fleet, destroyers and cruisers, consumed additional thousands of gallons daily. A single week of operations for this carrier task force consumed more fuel oil than Japan could allocate to its entire combined fleet for a month by late 1943. American fuel supplies, drawn from Texas, California, and Oklahoma oil fields producing millions of barrels annually, were effectively unlimited for military purposes, while Japanese fuel supplies, dependent on captured oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and vulnerable tanker routes, had become critically scarce. Commander Mitchell finished her initial assessment as the morning sun rose over Pearl Harbor, light streaming through the intelligence center windows to illuminate the reconnaissance photographs that would change strategic calculations throughout the Pacific. She knew this intelligence would be distributed to commanders across the theater, studied by planners preparing the next offensive operations, analyzed by strategists calculating force ratios and combat probabilities. But she also knew the photographs represented something beyond tactical intelligence. They represented proof of industrial capacity so overwhelming that traditional military calculations became almost irrelevant. The question was no longer whether America could win the Pacific War, but how quickly they could win it, and at what cost in lives on both sides before Japanese leadership accepted the inevitable. The 8 carriers in these photographs, the Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, and Cowpens, would go on to participate in every major Pacific campaign from late 1943 through the war's end. They would launch thousands of sorties, strike targets from the Philippines to Japan itself, support amphibious landings across the Central Pacific, and survive kamikaze attacks and typhoons. Some would be damaged, repaired, and returned to service within weeks. None would be sunk. Their survival rate alone testified to American industrial power, the ability to build ships tough enough to absorb damage that would have sunk earlier designs, equipped with damage control capabilities that allowed crews to save ships that would have been abandoned as lost in earlier conflicts. The intelligence photographs reached Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk within 6 hours of Commander Mitchell's initial assessment. The Pacific Fleet commander studied the images in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing as he processed the implications of what submarine SS-287 had documented. Nimitz had commanded the Pacific Fleet since the dark days immediately following Pearl Harbor, inheriting a battered force that many believed couldn't stop Japanese expansion across the Pacific. Now, less than 2 years later, he commanded a fleet that exceeded the entire Japanese Navy in carrier strength, with more vessels joining every month. The Admiral's Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Catherine Forrest, stood beside his desk, waiting for his reaction to the intelligence breakthrough. Admiral Forrest had served with Nimitz since early 1942, coordinating the complex logistics that kept the Pacific Fleet operational across vast ocean distances. She understood better than most the revolutionary change these 8 carriers represented. Before the war, naval strategy had been constrained by the assumption that carriers were precious, irreplaceable assets that should be husbanded carefully and risked only when absolutely necessary. The loss of a single carrier represented a catastrophic blow that would take years to replace. But these photographs proved that assumption obsolete. America could now deploy carriers in formations large enough to overwhelm any opposition, accepting the possibility of losses because replacement carriers were already under construction. The strategic calculation had fundamentally shifted from preserving scarce assets to employing abundant assets aggressively. Nimitz finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of strategic revelation. They don't know yet, do they? Japanese command hasn't grasped what this means. Admiral Forrest shook her head. Our intelligence suggests they're still operating on pre-war assumptions about carrier construction timelines. They believe replacing Midway losses will take us into late 1944 or 1945.
They have no framework for understanding production at this scale. The admiral nodded slowly, understanding the psychological dimension of the intelligence advantage. Japanese naval commanders were making strategic decisions based on outdated assumptions about American industrial capacity, planning operations and allocating resources as if the carrier balance remained roughly even, when in reality, the balance had shifted so dramatically the traditional naval strategy no longer applied. The photographs were classified at the highest level and distributed only to commanders who needed the information for operational planning. Nimitz understood the value of operational security, keeping Japanese command ignorant of American strength for as long as possible. But he also understood that eventually, perhaps soon, Japanese reconnaissance would document the same carrier formations that Commander Mitchell had analyzed. When that happened, when Tokyo fully grasped the scale of American carrier production, the psychological impact would be devastating. Japanese naval strategy, Japanese war planning, perhaps Japanese willingness to continue the war, all depended on the belief that they could still achieve decisive victory through superior tactics and fighting spirit. These photographs proved that belief was fantasy. Admiral Forrest began coordinating with fleet commanders to exploit the carrier advantage. Vice Admiral Rebecca Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, received orders to plan offensive operations that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Instead of carefully husbanding carriers and risking them only in critical battles, Spruance could now plan sustained offensive campaigns that would keep multiple carrier task forces at sea continuously, striking targets across the Central Pacific, supporting amphibious landings, and maintaining air superiority over vast ocean areas. The carriers would operate not as precious assets to be preserved, but as consumable tools to be used aggressively, confident that losses could be replaced faster than they accumulated. The Gilbert Islands invasion, scheduled for November 1943, would be the first operation to fully exploit the new carrier abundance. Operation Galvanic would employ 6 carriers in direct support, with 2 more in reserve, a concentration of naval air power unprecedented in Pacific operations. The carriers would launch over 500 aircraft in coordinated strikes, suppressing Japanese defenses on Tarawa and Makin atolls, providing continuous air cover for landing forces and interdicting any Japanese attempt to reinforce or resupply the garrisons. Previous amphibious operations had struggled with inadequate air support, carriers forced to withdraw after brief strikes to avoid Japanese counterattack. Now, with 6 carriers operating together, air support could be sustained indefinitely, overwhelming Japanese defenses through sheer volume of sorties rather than tactical brilliance. Commander Mitchell continued her intelligence work, tracking Japanese reactions as reconnaissance reports filtered back to Tokyo. The first Japanese awareness of American carrier strength came through submarine observations in early November 1943. Periscope sightings of multiple carrier formations that Japanese naval intelligence initially dismissed as identification errors or double counting. How could the Americans have 8 carriers in one formation when their entire pre-war carrier fleet numbered only 7? The reports must be wrong. Reconnaissance officers making mistakes under the pressure of operating in enemy-controlled waters. But as additional sightings accumulated from multiple sources, submarines, patrol aircraft, coast watchers on Japanese-held islands, the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, received the intelligence reports with growing alarm. Ozawa had been one of Japan's most innovative naval commanders, an early advocate of carrier aviation who understood air power better than most of his colleagues. He had planned and executed the Pearl Harbor strike, coordinated carrier operations throughout the Pacific, and trained the pilots who had dominated the early war months. But even Ozawa, with his understanding of carrier warfare, struggled to comprehend the scale of American production these reports described.
8 carriers in a single formation meant the Americans had built more carriers in 2 years than Japan had built in 2 decades. The implications were staggering. Ozawa called a conference of his senior staff, spreading reconnaissance photographs and intelligence summaries across the wardroom table of his flagship, the carrier Zoikaku. The officers studied the evidence in silence, each grappling with the reality it represented. Captain Toshiko Yamamoto, Ozawa's operations officer, finally articulated what everyone was thinking. If these reports are accurate, we cannot win this war through naval combat. They can replace losses faster than we can inflict them. Every carrier we sink will be replaced by 2 more within months. Our strategy has been based on achieving decisive victory through superior tactics. But tactics cannot overcome this level of industrial disparity. The silence that followed her assessment was profound. Officers confronting the collapse of assumptions that had guided their entire naval careers. Admiral Ozawa ordered his staff to calculate force ratios and project future carrier strengths based on estimated American construction rates. The analysis, completed over several days of intensive work, painted a picture of inevitable defeat. By mid-1944, American carrier strength would reach 15 to 20 fleet carriers, with dozens of light carriers and escort carriers in addition. By 1945, the numbers would climb to 30 or 40 fleet carriers, a force so large it could operate in multiple theaters simultaneously, while maintaining overwhelming superiority in the Pacific. Japanese carrier strength, by contrast, would continue declining as combat losses and fuel shortages reduced operational capability. Japan might, with maximum effort and perfect luck, maintain 4 to 5 operational carriers through 1944. By 1945, Japanese carrier forces might cease to exist as an effective combat force.
The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers was profound and devastating. They had entered the war believing in decisive battle, the idea that superior Japanese training, tactics, and fighting spirit could overcome American material advantages. The early victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies had seemed to confirm this belief. Even the loss at Midway had been rationalized as a tactical mistake rather than proof of strategic mismatch. But these intelligence reports about American carrier production demolished the foundation of Japanese naval confidence. This wasn't about tactics or training or fighting spirit. This was about industrial capacity so overwhelming that military skill became almost irrelevant. Commander Mitchell, tracking Japanese communications through signals intelligence, observed the shift in Japanese operational patterns that reflected their growing awareness of American strength. Japanese carriers, which had operated aggressively in the early war, now remained close to home waters, conducting training exercises at anchor to conserve fuel, avoiding engagements where they might face superior American forces. Japanese naval aviation, once offensive and aggressive, became defensive and conservative, husbanding resources, avoiding losses, waiting for the decisive battle opportunity that would never come. The shift represented more than tactical adjustment. It represented the recognition of defeat, the understanding that the war was lost even if fighting continued. Admiral Nimitz authorized Commander Mitchell to prepare a comprehensive assessment of Japanese naval psychology based on signals intelligence and prisoner interrogations. Mitchell interviewed Japanese naval officers captured during the Gilbert Islands operation, men who had witnessed American carrier strength firsthand and struggled to process what they had seen. One destroyer captain, pulled from the water after his ship was sunk by American carrier aircraft, described the American air attack with a mixture of professional respect and existential despair. The aircraft came in waves, coordinated strikes from multiple carriers, replacing losses immediately, attacking continuously for hours. We shot down perhaps 20 aircraft. They launched 200 more. This wasn't combat. This was industrial execution.
We had no chance, not because we fought poorly, but because we fought an enemy who could afford to be wasteful with resources we would never possess. The prisoner interviews revealed the deep psychological impact of facing overwhelming material superiority. Japanese naval personnel had been trained to believe that spiritual strength, Bushido warrior ethics, and willingness to sacrifice would overcome American softness and material dependence. But combat experience taught them that American forces were neither soft nor dependent on luxury. American sailors fought with skill and determination, supported by industrial capacity that could sustain continuous combat operations indefinitely. One Japanese pilot shot down during the Tarawa strikes and rescued by American forces described watching American carrier operations with growing horror. They launched strikes all day, every day, for a week. Hundreds of sorties. We calculated they were losing aircraft to accidents and anti-aircraft fire at rates that would have grounded our entire air group.
But they kept launching. New aircraft replaced losses overnight. New pilots appeared to replace casualties. It was endless. We could never sustain operations like this. Our entire carrier force couldn't generate the sorties one American task force launched in a single day. Admiral Forrest used Mitchell's intelligence assessments to brief fleet commanders on Japanese psychological vulnerabilities. The enemy wasn't just outmatched materially, they knew they were outmatched, and that knowledge was eroding fighting effectiveness faster than combat losses. Japanese pilots flew with the certain knowledge that every mission might be their last, not because of enemy skill, but because of mathematical inevitability in a war of attrition against unlimited resources. Japanese commanders planned operations knowing that success would be temporary, that any tactical victory would be overwhelmed by American counterattacks, supported by resources Japan could never match. The psychological burden of fighting a war you knew was already lost, that had perhaps been lost before it began, manifested in declining morale, increasing desertion rates among rear area personnel, and growing willingness among captured personnel to cooperate with interrogators. The Marshall Islands operation in early 1944 demonstrated the practical application of American carrier superiority. 12 carriers participated in Operation Flintlock, launching over 600 aircraft in coordinated strikes that suppressed Japanese defenses across dozens of islands simultaneously. The operation achieved air superiority so complete that Japanese aircraft rarely appeared, destroyed on the ground or shot down immediately after takeoff by overwhelming American fighter patrols. American carrier aircraft ranged freely over Japanese-held islands, striking targets at will, providing continuous close air support for landing forces and interdicting Japanese supply lines. The operation succeeded with minimal American losses, not because of tactical brilliance, but because of resource advantage so great that tactical mistakes could be absorbed without compromising mission success. Commander Mitchell documented Japanese communications during the Marshall Islands operation, intercepts that revealed command confusion and despair as reports of American carrier strength accumulated. Japanese base commanders radioed Tokyo with estimates of American forces that were dismissed as exaggerated or panic-driven, until multiple sources confirmed the same impossible numbers. 12 carriers, over 600 aircraft, continuous operations for weeks without apparent resupply needs. Japanese naval command struggled to formulate responses to attacks that overwhelmed defensive capabilities through sheer volume rather than tactical sophistication. Defense plans were based on assumptions about limited American resources, requiring careful allocation and prioritization. But American forces operated as if resources were unlimited, launching maximum effort strikes against secondary targets simply because they could, because the industrial capacity existed to support operations at intensity levels that seemed wasteful by Japanese standards. The intelligence photographs that had crossed Commander Mitchell's desk in November 1943 had documented more than 8 carriers steaming in formation.
They had documented the death of Japanese naval strategy, the collapse of assumptions about resource parity that had justified starting the Pacific War. Japanese naval commanders, studying the same photographs through their own intelligence sources, understood they were looking at proof of defeat. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, desperate fighting on islands across the Pacific, kamikaze attacks born of desperation rather than strategy, last-ditch defensive operations as American forces closed on the home islands. But the outcome was already determined by the industrial capacity those 8 carriers represented, the ability to produce carriers faster than they could be sunk, to replace losses faster than they accumulated, to sustain operations at intensity levels that overwhelmed defense through sheer volume of resources applied continuously and without apparent limit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.